Did ranked choice voting cost Sarah Palin the special election? Palin seems to think so. The media also seems to think so, but I'm pretty sure the actual answer to this is probably not, and we're going to explore in this video. Stick around. So first of all, my name's Cody, and I actually love ranked choice voting. I'm a huge proponent of it. If you've never heard of it, no problem. We're going to cover it in this video. But if you have heard of it and you love ranked choice voting, I would actually invite you to check out the Forward Party, because that's actually one of their main first objectives, is to implement ranked choice voting and open primaries throughout the country as much as possible. And I will have some upcoming videos where I introduce you guys to the Forward Party. And by the way, I think you can actually support both Forward and the Democrats simultaneously. And if you're more on the right side of the political spectrum, I still think that Forward is a good place for you. So, keep an open mind and check it out. So today, this is part one in a two-part series, and I'm making this series to clarify some misconceptions I've seen around this recent election. So things I've seen in the media, as well as Sarah Palin's statements especially, and just generically online. And the main claim is that Palin lost this election due to ranked choice voting. And this actually seems incorrect to me based on the data. And we're going to explore how she likely would have lost under normal circumstances as well. And my hope is that this will also help people better understand how ranked choice voting works. And the last thing I want to say before we start is that ranked choice voting really shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's a superior voting system that allows voters to better express their preferences. And some Republicans, like Sarah Palin, are trying to paint this as a piece of the Democratic Party agenda, but it's really not. There are some Republicans who like ranked choice voting. There are some Democrats who like ranked choice voting. It's really nonpartisan. And if it were true that it were a cornerstone of the Democratic Party, there would be no reason for Andrew Yang to be starting the Forward Party. So claims that ranked choice voting is a partisan issue are just unfounded. All right, so the beautiful thing about ranked choice voting, one beautiful thing of many, is that we get amazing voter data that tells us how every single voter feels about the candidates. And this isn't polling, right? Because polling is when you ask a small sample of the population, hey, how do you feel about this? And we've seen that that's not always super accurate. But with ranked choice voting, we get information from the entire population. And without this data, the discussions we're about to have wouldn't be nearly as substantiated. There would be just a lot of wishy-washy statements, and there's still going to be some of that in this series, but at least we have some concrete data that we can sink our teeth into. And lastly, I just want to say that ranked choice voting has many other benefits in addition to this, and you can check out my upcoming videos for more. So the topic of today's video is the Alaska special election, and the purpose of this election, if you aren't familiar, was to fill the only Alaskan seat in the House of Representatives, which became vacant after a recently deceased Don Young. And this seat will be up for grabs again in November. I'm recording this in September, so that is pretty soon. Now, in terms of the election format, Alaska actually recently switched to ranked choice voting and open primaries, which I'm very happy about. Hats off to them. That's what we want to see throughout the country. And their style of primary is called a top four primary. And the way it works is that you run all of the candidates in one big primary simultaneously. So it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you all run together. And the top four from that primary advance to the general election. Then Alaska has a ranked choice voting general election. And here are our candidates. So we have Sarah Palin, who I'm calling the Trump Republican. We have Nick Begich III, who I'm calling the moderate Republican, and we have Mary Peltola, who is our Democrat. And I believe there was one more Democrat who ended up dropping out of the race, so we only have three candidates. Now we're going to walk through the ranked choice voting process together, and we're going to use the data from this election, more or less. So the way it works is that for you on an individual voter level, you're going to rank your candidates on your ballot. So number one is your favorite candidate, number two is your second favorite, and so on. And then you submit your ballot. Pretty easy. In terms of counting the votes, we are now going to count the votes in rounds. So in the first round, we're going to count all of the first rank votes, and we're checking to see if anyone has a majority. If someone has a majority, the election is immediately over and they win. But oftentimes, no one will have a majority. in which case you need to continue the ranked choice voting process and we move to the second round. And here we are going to eliminate the last place candidate, then reallocate those votes, and then count again, checking to see if anyone has a majority. And in this case, this was only a 3-person election, and so there is a winner after the second round. So now we have our candidates, and we're going to walk through this process together. So round 1, we're going to count all the first rank picks, and the data for that looks something like this. And we're checking to see, does anyone have a majority? Does anyone have more than 50%? And in this case, no. So we continue to round 2, where now we will eliminate the last place candidate, which in this case was Nick Begich in the middle. Then we are going to reallocate those votes. And the reallocation isn't random. It's based on each individual voter's preference of who they put as their number 2 pick. And let's watch this little animation where the votes get reallocated to the other 2 candidates. Then we are going to count the votes again, checking to see, does anyone have a majority? And in this case, Mary Peltola does have more than 50%. Therefore, the election is over and Mary Peltola wins. Congratulations. So now let's talk about claims to be evaluated in this video. So Palin is claiming that she lost the election due to ranked choice voting. She's also claiming that 60% of voters were disenfranchised by ranked choice voting. That's the most egregious claim, and that one is blatantly false, as we will discuss. She also claimed that Nick Begich spoiled the election, and we're going to discuss that in the next video. And she claims that Nick Begich's criticism of her led to her loss. And again, we'll discuss that next time. And the media in general is claiming that ranked choice voting was pivotal in the outcome of this election. So we're going to evaluate all these claims in this series. So now let's walk through the actual election again. And here is the process for reference. And here is a great graphic from the Washington Post. And it's maybe a little overwhelming at first, but that's why we're going to go through it together. And in the first round, we are going to count the votes. So we are looking in this region here, and we're checking to see, does anyone have a majority? Does anyone have more than 50%? And in this case, no. So we continue to round 2, where we are going to eliminate the last place candidate, which is Nick Begich. And then we are going to reallocate those votes, which you see here with these 2 black arrows. And some votes will go towards Mary Peltola. Some votes will go towards Sarah Palin. It's based on what each individual voter put as their second pick. Then we are going to count the votes again. So we are looking in this bottom region here, and we're checking to see, does anyone have a majority? And in this case, Mary Peltola does actually have 51%. Therefore, the election is over and Mary Peltola wins. Now, if you're wondering what is this little gray region of the graphic, these are called exhausted votes, and these are Nick Begich voters who didn't rank a second candidate. So their votes don't go towards anyone in the second round. And we're going to discuss these voters more in the next video. So the first claim to be evaluated. So remember that Sarah Palin claimed that 60% of voters were disenfranchised by ranked choice voting. And this is the most egregious claim, but let's first talk about, where does this come from? So it is actually true that 60% of voters voted for a Republican in round 1. So if we look at our graphic, 60% of voters voted for a Republican in round 1. But this doesn't mean that 60% of voters are diehard Republicans who are going to always vote Republican no matter what. And the reality is that some of them actually prefer Peltola over Palin. And actually, there are 15,000 of them represented in this purple region here. So these are Nick Begich supporters who prefer Mary Peltola over Sarah Palin. And this essentially means that these voters prefer Peltola over Palin in a head-to-head race. Because if you think about a Nick Begich voter filling out their ballot, they put Nick Begich number 1, that's their favorite. Then, as their number 2 pick, they realize, okay, if Nick Begich is eliminated, who do I prefer between Mary Peltola and Sarah Palin? That is a head-to-head race, and 15,000 voters are telling us they prefer Peltola. And ranked choice voting actually freed these voters to express their true preference because it allowed them to put Nick Begich number 1 and Mary Peltola number 2. So it didn't disenfranchise them, it actually enabled them to better express their preference. And regardless of whether this was a ranked choice voting election or not, these people still exist. This preference in the population still exists, and ranked choice voting just allowed them to better express it. So let's check back in on our first claim. And the claim was that 60% of voters were disenfranchised by ranked choice voting. And our verdict on this is totally myth busted. This is totally not true. And many Begich supporters actually preferred Mary Peltola over Sarah Palin. And ignoring that fact dishonors their preference and just completely ignores reality, right? These are individuals, right? They have their own individual preferences, and we should respect that. So let's look back on Sarah Palin's statement from August 31st. And here's the whole statement. You can pause it if you want to read all of that. I'm just going to zoom in on this one little sentence where she says, ranked choice voting effectively disenfranchised 60% of Alaska voters. And once again, this is totally busted, totally not true. Moving on to the biggest question, which is, did Sarah Palin lose due to ranked choice voting? Would Sarah Palin have won under normal circumstances? And was ranked choice voting pivotal in the outcome of this election? Basically all the same question in different words. We're going to take a look. But first, I want to remind you that the beautiful thing about ranked choice voting is we get this amazing voter data that tells us how every single voter feels about the candidates. And this is so much better than polling because we get info from everyone. And we're going to use this data to make inferences about a hypothetical head-to-head race. So now let's run through our hypothetical normal election. And the process is going to be that we will first run our primaries to get one Republican nominee and one Democrat nominee. And then we are going to run our general election. All right. So, question to the audience, who wins the Republican primary? Is there any way we could know this? Well, if we look in our data and we look at the first round data here in this region, we see that of Republican voters, Sarah Palin has a majority. So it seems very likely that Sarah Palin would have won the Republican primary. And we know Mary Peltola is the Democratic nominee, so we don't have to do anything there. So now we have our one Republican and one Democrat, and now they will advance to the general election. And question again to the audience, who will win in the general election between Sarah Palin and Mary Peltola? Is there any way we could know this? The answer to this, I think, is actually yes, because we can look at our final round data, which is essentially a head-to-head race, and that data is telling us that Mary Peltola will win with 51% of the vote. So even under normal circumstances, Mary Peltola still wins this election, according to our data. So now let's check back in on our second claim. So the claim was ranked choice voting was pivotal in the outcome of this election. And our verdict on this? The data suggests otherwise. So you can maybe come up with some arguments to overrule that data, and we're going to talk about that next time. But the data itself is telling us that Mary Peltola would have won under normal circumstances as well. And I want to point out that maybe there was no impact on the outcome this time, but in some elections, it really does matter. So for instance, if we compare this to the Al Gore versus George Bush versus Ralph Nader election in 2000, in that election, ranked choice voting almost certainly would have changed the outcome to better reflect the will of the people. And in other words, Al Gore almost certainly would have won in Florida because Ralph Nader voters would have ranked Al Gore number 2 by a much higher margin. And then Al Gore would have gone on to win that election, better reflecting the will of the people. So now let's look back on Sarah Palin's statement from August 31st. So here's the same statement as before. Let's zoom in on the snippet where she says, ranked choice voting was sold as the way to make elections better reflect the will of the people. Let me pause right there. It is. As Alaska and America now sees, the exact opposite is true. The people of Alaska do not want the destructive Democrat agenda to rule our land and our lives, but that's what resulted from someone's experiment with this new, crazy, convoluted, confusing ranked choice voting system. It's effectively disenfranchised 60% of Alaska voters. So there's a lot in there that I strongly disagree with, but I want to reiterate that this is not a Democrat agenda. And if it were, there would be no reason for the Forward Party to exist. And we also had a New York Times article where they said that, but Alaska's new voting system also played a big role in Peltola's 3 percentage point victory over former Governor Sarah Palin, her Republican opponent. And I read the rest of this article, and I didn't see any real support for this claim. So you need concrete reasons to back this up. And it was a bit disappointing, to be honest. So let's talk about the power of voter data. So I want you guys to consider all the information we received about Alaskans because this was a ranked choice voting election and because Nick Begich was in the race. So let's consider an example question. So is there an ideological middle in Alaska? Well, under the ranked choice vote election, we actually do get data on this because we get to see how many people support Nick Begich in the middle. And on top of that, we get to see the breakdown of the Nick Begich supporters in terms of who prefers Peltola versus Palin. So by adding in just one more candidate, we got much more information about the population. And you can imagine that if you add in even more candidates, you get even more information. So ranked choice voting allows us to see in a much more fine-grained way what the population actually believes. And contrast this with a head-to-head race where it's only between Peltola and Palin, we wouldn't get nearly as much data on the middle. You can't really read into that. You know, how do you determine if there's a middle or not if there's only two candidates? So for this reason, this is why ranked choice voting can help steer future candidates and future party platforms to better reflect the will of the people. And this is one of the really underrated benefits of ranked choice voting, in my opinion. Conclusions today. Ranked choice voting provides amazing voter data. 60% of voters were not disenfranchised. And the data suggests that Palin did not lose due to ranked choice voting. Up next in part 2 of this series, we are going to discuss other factors of ranked choice voting that may or may not overrule this data. So maybe you can make some arguments to overrule the things that we've been over so far. We're going to take a look. And we're going to discuss why Sarah Palin may have actually spoiled the election for Nick Begich and not the other way around as she claimed. So thank you so much for joining me. Please like and subscribe. And most importantly, please share this with your friends and family. And I will see you next time. Thanks a lot.